Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson used hedges, originally Amur River privet hedges, to shape the space of the academic court, inserting a new horizontal layer above the flat ground plane, filling the emptiness of the court in its natural condition, and spatializing the projection of the main axis. They used Italian cypress trees, not for shade, but to mark off spatial intervals rhythmically, proportioning open space the way one would proportion a building, through the rhythmic repetition of columns, arches, or window openings. Looking back at the administration building, you can see that the landscape carries its lines forward onto the coastal plain, subduing the plain's monotony, filling its emptiness, and giving it the sense of rhythm, measure, and depth it was seen to lack in its natural state. Cram's vision was that this landscape architecture ensemble continue westward for 500 feet, roughly to the front of the Fondren Library. From that point, triple rows of live oaks would project the building facades parallel to the main axis, another 870 feet to the west to outline the Great Square. Basically, the idea was to take the line of the buildings represented by the Physics Building and Anderson Hall, and instead of just having more buildings going after that, to continue this line westward through these triple rows of live oak trees, which would outline a square even broader in its dimension than the academic court as one moved westward from the academic court into this even larger open space that the general plan called the Great Square. After the Fondren Library was built astride the axis, blocking its continuation in the late 1940s, the Rice Memorial Center and Rice Memorial Chapel were built in one of the lines of live oaks in 1958. So here you see those live oak trees. They were planted to either side of the library site, but when the library was built in the 1940s, they cut away at those lines of what were already mature live oak trees, and in the 50s built the Rice Memorial Center in what was to have been a continuation of that grove, even though it meant cutting down numerous mature trees to put the building on that site. Behind the Fondren Library, you can see the live oaks planted to enframe the Great Square and how they step out to narrow the space of the axis, constituting another threshold. If you stand behind the Fondren Library and look westward toward Rice Stadium, what you see is that these live oak trees on the south side turn before you get to that back street and kind of come across as though to frame an opening. What's no longer clear is that there's sort of three trees that frame it on this end. These trees were planted in the 1960s when the Rice Memorial Center was built. So they kind of confuse now what is the real center line of the Great Square. But you see that all of this landscape infrastructure was put in place to define this great open space, and then along they came and built a building where it wasn't supposed to be, doing, of course, great violence to the planted landscape. When Herring Hall was designed in the early 1980s, the architect Cesar Pelli carefully inserted it in the building space Cram had left among the live oak trees in order to begin to recover the integrity of the general plan. Experiencing the imagination, invention, and excitement that Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson elicit with their social construction of Rice space makes one look at the general plan not simply as a diagram, but as an inspired document, a magical map that systematically integrates functional considerations, desired adjacencies, and climatic responsiveness with shaping space and constructing identity. What you see is how Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson imposed a new spatial armature on the flat coastal plain. The main axis is, which of course begins here at entrance number 1, comes through that alley of live oak trees, penetrates the administration building through the sally port, and then was to continue westward. Here is the the great square, and you can see that it's outlined with those triple rows of live oak trees. But in the 40s, then the Fondren Library was built just about here. The main axis is paralleled by a secondary axis in the residential group, what are now Baker, Will Rice, Hanson colleges. The main axis is intersected by a series of cross-axes that link the different sectors of the university. Here, the first cross-axis from entrance number 3, the second from entrance number 4, another one to the west of that. Notice how these axes and cross-axes are spatialized with the planting of trees in masses to shape, direct, and inframe, to fill up space systematically in a way that buildings alone could not do when spread so far apart. And this slide is dark enough that you may not be able to see the little dots that represent all of the thousands of trees that Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson proposed to plant on this site. Moreover, Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson accorded these spaces different treatments, so that while they all shape space, direct movement, and frame vistas, they also construct distinct place identities within the university campus. The first cross-axis, beginning at Main and McGregor at entrance 3, differs therefore from the main axis as it moves from the residential group, here these buildings, again, sort of Baker College, Will Rice College, through the academic court, between Sewell Hall, the Physics Building, Anderson Hall, and Razor Hall, through a cross court, which is perceptually hard to see now because the trees were not planted as they were supposed to be, before culminating then in the Court of Engineering in front of the Mechanical Laboratory and Powerhouse, with the Campanile rising out of it. From east of Baker College in the residential group, the cross-axis leads to the academic court, and you see sort of beginning that progress, sort of standing here and looking past the East Hall of Baker College into the academic court. But as you can see during winter, the trees that outline the cross-axis are not evergreen live oaks, but once they come into leaf, deciduous cedar elms. In contrast to the unchanging verdure of the main axis and its tributaries, sort of lined with evergreen live oaks, the cross-axis measures time seasonally, in that, of course, its deciduous trees lose their leaves during the winter and then regain them in the spring. The cross-axis defers to the academic court. The elm trees are suppressed and do not reappear until one has crossed the court and moved alongside the physics building. So as you can see, as you continue northward toward the Mechanical Laboratory and Powerhouse, you pass out of that line of deciduous cedar elm trees into the open space of the academic court. But on the other side, to the north, you re-enter the continuation of that alley of cedar elm trees. Note that this cross-axis is also different from the main axis in that the narrow sides of Cram's long, thin buildings abut it rather than outline it. So here, the long front of the physics building outlines the main axis, whereas on the cross-axis, what you get is this rhythm of narrow ends abutting the cross-axis as you move from south to north. There is a curious lapse in the tree line as one approaches the campus loop street between the back of the physics building and the front of the chemistry building. Basically, that line of cedar elms does not continue all the way to the curb line of the street that runs here behind the physics amphitheater and in front of the physics building. And you can see here also, in front of the chemistry building. You can see in front of the chemistry building, it's also quite open. Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson intended that the live oak trees planted along the campus loop street step back from the street and enframe an open square which the street would run through on center. If I could just back up to the general plan to kind of make this diagram a little bit clearer. Again, you can see as you're sort of walking north here through the academic court, the tree line starts up, but then it stops before you get to the curb line. And what Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson proposed was that as those live oak trees sort of round the corner here by the physics amphitheater, they come to a stop. And they were supposed to then outline, they were to step in as the buildings step in and outline this open space so that you have this very unusual landscape reversal. Basically, this tight line of trees suddenly opens up to frame an open space in which there is no building, but instead in which these these paths of movement intersect. Live oak trees were never planted to outline the square. Since there seemed to be an inexplicable hole here, a more recent generation of landscape consultants sought to plug it by planting new live oaks in rows along the street. While it's hard to fault tree planting, the failure to understand and honor Cram's intention subverts the nuances of his space-making plan and the progression of open and closed spaces that were meant to give this cross-axis its distinct identity. This cross-axis leads head-on into the court of engineering. It is intriguing to observe in the general plan that Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson tended to make buildings that terminated axes of view symmetrical, in contrast to buildings that outlined axes, which were asymmetrical. Symmetry, therefore, identifies the mechanical laboratory as the destination of the cross-axis. This is further emphasized by the campanile, its romantic name notwithstanding. The campanile was the smokestack for the powerhouse, not a bell tower, which turns the cross-axis upward on a vertical coordinate. Typically, though, Cram's architectural exclamation of "the end" was projected at the scale of the landscape, while at the scale of the building, nuance took over. The cloister of the mechanical laboratory is highly activated spatially, despite the fact that the front of the building is extremely plain. With its vaulted ceilings, its picturesque incidents responsive to what is going on inside the building. Here, of course, this balcony with this pair of French doors which sort of projects into the space of the cloister. And its consistent treatment of circumstantial incident through the medium of space, as one can see in this secondary entrance, where every stage telescopes in a descending hierarchy of curvilinear volumes. Of course, to begin with the primary curvilinear volume, the vault of the cloister, you go through this archway up several steps. There are entrances to, I think, what was originally the kind of men's locker room. The mechanical laboratory sort of doubled as the locker room for athletics in the Institute's first year. And there was a kind of another secondary entrance to laboratory space. But here, the back wall of this space is a niche, an apsidal niche. It, too, rises to a shallow vault. There's another kind of vault in here, a vaulted ceiling, and there's even a vaulted drinking fountain set in here. So there is this kind of wonderful telescoping sequence of curvilinear spaces that activates, again, what presents itself from the front as this very planar building. Behind the mechanical laboratory, but on the cross-axis, imbuing it with an afterlife, is the powerhouse, where another hierarchy of composition and decoration narrates the relationship of the powerhouse, this portion of the building where originally all of the university's utilities were generated and distributed, the powerhouse and its production spaces to the mechanical laboratory and its academic spaces. Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson never stopped. Their spatial order encompassed the distribution of utilities in their social construction of community, indicating, however, its service as opposed to honorific status. And you can see as you kind of move step by step, you kind of have a last blast of ornament here in these wonderful Byzantine stilted arches with their marble colonnettes before stepping around to the sides of the powerhouse. And note here the granite base course stops. And then it's just brick all the way. And when you get to the back of this building, there is no stone whatsoever. It's all simply brick. The residential group exhibits Cram's techniques for constructing unity with variety in terms of architectural style. Cram aligned the first three dormitory groups, constructed between 1912 and 1916, now Will Rice, Baker, and Hanson colleges, along an axis that paralleled the main axis. Live oaks were planted in front of Will Rice and Hanson to outline one edge of the secondary axis. When the residential college additions were made to Will Rice and Hanson in 1957, they were built in the right-of-the-way of the axis, preserving the general plan's idea, but reducing the width of the axis to 1/3 the dimension Cram had intended. So basically, today, between the old wing of Will Rice and the new wing, you have a quadrangle. In Cram's plan, these were not to be parts of the same college. They were to be different colleges, separated by this very wide axis that paralleled the main axis. So when the residential college additions were made in the 1950s, they framed this axial space as intended in the general plan, but they narrowed this dimension as they made this kind of one college complex instead of two. I assume that Cram spaced these original colleges very far apart, knowing the proclivity of their young male occupants to have wars with each other. Cram used architectural style, embodied in the composition of facades and the choice of building materials, to indicate that these were residential rather than academic buildings. Gray stucco is the predominant facing material, with brick used more sparingly than on academic buildings, and stone used only as trim material. Rather than organizing the buildings symmetrically, they are purposefully asymmetrical. Interior spaces read through onto the exterior, most clearly in the Institute Commons, now the Commons of Baker College, where the Commons Room, the 5-story faculty tower, and the dining hall constantly shift shape and decoration to identify these component spaces rather than masking them with the unifying facade. And so again, these buildings, say in contrast to the academic buildings, particularly the mechanical laboratory or the administration building, where you have symmetrical facades. Here, not only are the facades asymmetrical, but the differing nature of the internal spaces read through onto the exterior. So as you walk along this building, as the interior spaces change, so does the composition of the exterior. The buildings have distinct fronts and backs, with the fronts facing south into the prevailing breeze, as at the West Hall of Hanson College. Here you see the south-facing front, so it sort of turns its back on the direction of the academic buildings along the main axis. Details vary from like space to like space, as a comparison of the cloister linking Baker and Will Rice with the south-facing cloister looking into Will Rice's quadrangle demonstrates. And again, in Cram's plan, he had really thought that Baker and Will Rice would be part of the same residential college. So what one sees is that even within what he conceived of as being part of the same group, he consistently changed the character of like spaces as you move from one part of the complex to the other, and in that way was constantly inventing new identities for ever kind of smaller realms of place, yet at the same time kind of preserving the sense of spatial continuity, so that rather than seeming busy, it enlivened and again sort of gave distinct identities to these different spaces. The discourse of distinction is carried down to the level of details. The honorific window framing that identifies the presence of the Baker College Library from the outside, and the capitals of the cloister columns on the east hall of Baker, with their recitation of passages from Proverbs and the wisdom of Solomon, invoking wisdom. I'm sure a lot of good that did to those rowdy students. Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson's architecture is so rich and captivating that it is tempting to indulge in the pleasure of cataloging all their ingenuities and inventions. After World War I, the Rice Institute, which had seemed so extraordinarily well endowed when it opened in 1912, entered into a period of financial limitation that prevailed until the end of World War II. Only 2 buildings deemed permanent were constructed during the 31-year interval between the completion of West Hall at Hanson in 1916 and the opening of Anderson Hall in 1947.